Warning. This addendum contains the project, clearance priority, and memetic hazard classes of Process Report 052618 codenamed malfeasance. Risk acceptance confirmation is required. Acknowledgement. Confirmed. Access granted. Graham Corporation. Addendum 052918-3. As per relevant MeTras and SPAN Department, Addendum 052918-3 has been prepared for dissemination. Attached for review.
Hey again, everyone. So this is part 2 of learning how to play Lain Protocol. In the first part, we talked about just about everything except combat. Now, hopefully this will be short, but combat involves many of the aspects of the previous video. So if you haven't watched that, go ahead and watch it. It should be in the description box below, or it could just be the previous video in the feed. So go ahead and check that out. And then, if you have, this transition will make a lot more sense. All right, here we go. We're back in Tabletop Simulator. And remember, the goal is to use these target hack tokens to move through the network, reach the center, and then accompany yourself to a victory condition based on what's written there. So let's say the players decide they want to attack this signatures database. They have a target hack token that's directly located beside it. There is no lockdown token stopping them from getting there, and everything else is fine. So, first thing you do is you take that threat and you move it over here to the combat board and place it under current threat. It has 30 and 1, which symbolizes 30 connection and 1 payload. We'll talk about the difference between payload and interference soon. The next thing that happens is we take a look at the number that was on that threat. It was 1. This indicates the number of complications that get added. Remember how I said in the previous video, tracked was very important? You add 1 complication for each tracked player that you have as well. So let's say this is the start of the game. No one is tracked yet. And this just has 1 complication beside it. So we draw the top complication, we place it here, and we flip it up. Now, combat is a bit involved. That's why every player has a combat order chart. So there's 1, 2, 3, and 4, 1 for each player. And we're going to borrow 1 right now so that we can discuss this in detail and not miss anything. So let's go ahead, place that here, turn this sideways, move my kitty, and talk about it. So the first thing that happens is we reveal the complications. And then we'll skip what this says right now to go on to the next thing, which is on encounter. Now each of these parentheses means if this thing has these words, then those effects happen at this time. So on encounter effects will happen at this time. We take a look at our complication Wireshark, and it says on encounter, each player gains 1 interference. So that would happen first. So each one of these players will gain 1 interference. Hey, what a way to start things out. Alright, the players choose the intercepting player. This is the next step, and there's no nice way to say this. One person's gonna get wailed on, and you all have to figure out who it's gonna be. Like, just like, hey, you, take damage. And so that's exactly what you do. So because this guy here has an exploit that passively starts him with 5 connection instead of 4, he'll choose to be the intercepting player for the purpose of this example. Then, if there are any on-intercept effects, they happen at this time. These effects only happen on threats and complications. Again, threats and complications. This threat doesn't have any after-attack effects, and this doesn't have any rather on-intercept effects, and neither does this threat. So that is nothing to worry about. The next thing that happens is before attack effects. So let's take a look here. Signatures database doesn't have any before attack effects, and neither does this complication, so we skip this step. Then the threat attack phase. Now this is where that number for the payload over here on the bottom right hand corner is very important. The way this works is you roll 1 die for each payload that the player or the threat, at this time, the threat possesses. If it is a 1 or a 2, it does 0 damage. If it's a 3, 4, or 5, the player takes 1 interference. If it's a 6, the player takes 2 interference. So let's see what we get. 4. So the intercepting player, who is this guy, takes 1 interference. Next thing that happens is after attack effects. Now if we notice, Signatures database does have an after attack effect. It says, after attack, Intercepting player receives 1 log token. So let's go ahead and give our player that log token. Now you may have noticed, the shrewd or quick-eyed among you, that this thing has an effect called alert, which says after attack, intercepting player receives an additional log token. Alert is something that is activated as soon as you get to the middle of the board. Once you get to the middle of the board and reveal whatever is in that middle section, a couple of things happen. First, alert effects on all cards happen. Alert effects are more powerful than basic effects and happen in addition. So for example, if we had already reached the center of this network, instead of the intercepting player receiving 1 log token, they would receive 1 and then receive another log token. So they would receive 2 at a time. Next thing that's worth mentioning is that when you reach the center, noise becomes meaningless. So it doesn't matter once you reach the center whether or not players get 14 noise, 15 noise, 157,000 noise. It doesn't matter anymore at that point. But that means that the after attack effects of signatures database have happened. Now, starting with the intercepting player and moving clockwise so that each player has their turn, each player gets 2 action points. Now remember what we said in part 1. These player actions can be used as many times in a combat as you want, whereas each of these exploits can only be used 1 time per exploit per combat. So, let's take a look here and see, we have probe F. So this player is going to choose to gain 1 interference and select another player. That player gains plus 1 payload on their next turn. He uses it once, and then he's going to use Brute Force E, which is another player action. Deal 4 interference to a threat, then you gain 1 log token. So interference is strict damage. It's just an automatic 4. It is not to be confused with payload. And so now we'll move on to the next player, the one who has been made more powerful by the effects of the previous player. So they have social engineering. They use this exploit and will give them plus 1 payload until the end of combat. And as their second action, they will use Brute Force D, which deals 7 payload to a threat, and then they either become tracked and gain 1 interference, or lose an action point next round. Remember, each player only has 2 action points, so they're going to use Brute Force D. Now, Social Engineering gave them plus 1 payload, and our previous player's use of Probe F gave them another plus 1 payload. So this player, instead of dealing 7 payload with the effective Brute Force D, is going to deal 9 payload. And so, hopefully they don't roll a bunch of 1s. This is the difference between payload and interference. You roll payload, and then you deal interference based on your rolled payload. So this player deals, this misses, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 interference. And normally this would be 7, 8, but their Probe D says any of your unmodified 6 rolls deal plus 1 interference. So instead of 2, this deals 3. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Puts this threat down to 17. Play continues like this for each of the players until one of 2 things happens. Either the threat is defeated, in which case it goes and its complications go in the discard, or all of the players are defeated, in which case they lose, which would be bad. Now let's say that this threat, let's answer a couple of questions with this threat as an example. So, let's say the intercepting player is disconnected. Well, what does that mean? Disconnected is whenever a player has interference that is at as much or more than their current connection. So some effects will give you temporary bonus connection, something like this. In that case, right now, the player is not disconnected. As crazy as it sounds, they have 7 connection and 6 interference. But now they have 8 interference and 7 connection. When you are disconnected, you automatically become tracked. If at the end of the round, this player is still in a state where they're disconnected, if they're still in a state where they have more interference than they have connection, then they can no longer be the intercepting player, someone else must be. Additionally, if a player is disconnected, they cannot use any of their actions. They have 0 action points. So let's say somehow this person is attacked, they become disconnected, but because they're the intercepting player, it's now their turn. Well, they have 0 action points because they are disconnected. A couple other things that happen. So let's talk about multi-threading. Each of these exploits has 2 items. They have basic, which is a flip this card upside down to get this effect, and then they have multi-threading. Multi-threading works as follows. So let's take cross-site script as an example. Multi-threading means you must use this exploit this many times in one round of combat, which is between when a threat attacks and all of the players get their turn. That constitutes one round. If this threat is used that many unique times in that round, then get its bonus effect. So, cross-site script says, multi-threading 2, if this card is used twice, basically, in one round of combat, remove 1 complication from the current threat. Now remember, when you use an exploit, it just flips and you don't get it back until the start of the next combat. So you would need another player to have access to cross-site script and use it on this round of combat in order to get that effect. Nifty. Let's also talk about end of the round effects. So the only cards that have end of the round effects are complications and threats. End of the round effects only happen after everything else in this loop, and they only happen if the threat is still connected. So let's say at the end of the first round of combat, let's pull an example. Here we go. Let's say this card has end of the round. Intercepting player receives 2 log tokens, but it has 1 connection left. Well, then the intercepting player would receive 2 log tokens. However, let's say at the end of the round, because it has been defeated already, this threat has 0 or less, or way less connection. It has less than 0 is the point. Nice. Then end of the round effects don't happen. You can ignore them. They only happen if the threat is still connected. That is, they have more than 0 connection at the end of the round. And just as a quick reminder, after you defeat this threat, all of its complications get discarded. It gets discarded. You get 1 exploit. You move your target hack token forward. You flip open or access new areas of the network based on the direct connected lines between your current node and those nodes. And if you have 4 successful hacks, you will flip over all of the hacks. Each player will choose 1, and everyone will lose any interference that they have. And that's it. That's combat. So with this in the previous video, you're now free to go play a rousing game of Lain Protocol and let me know what you think. Thanks again, and I'll talk to you in the next one.
DNE. Odin. Divisions 1 and 2. Third Eye Department.